In this chapter, we are going to see the muscles, blood vessels and nerves associated with lateral wall of thorax. Now you are able to see the lateral wall of thorax and also part of the abdomen. At this stage, see the forelimb is removed from the body by cutting the latissimus dorsi, pectorals, brachiocephalicus, brachial plexus and brachial artery by making an incision midway between the forelimb and lateral wall of thorax. Hence, part of all these structures can also be seen. And also, skin covering is removed by making a mid-dorsal incision, and then skin is carefully removed as a single flap towards the ventral aspect. Before going to start the dissection proper, let us see some landmarks on the lateral wall of thorax. Let us start from the dorsal aspect. See, the yellow colored band-like structure below the skin is the dorsal part of supraspinous ligament. This will continue forward as ligamentum nuchae. Below this, these are the muscles on the caudolateral part of the cervical region. See the ribs which are numbered from 1 to 13 and the intercostal spaces in between the ribs. This triangular area behind the posterior border of the last rib is the paralumbar fossa. This is the floor of the thorax formed by sternum. Take a look at this shiny, fibrous band-like structure. This is the rectus thoracis muscle. It arises from the lower half of the lateral surface of the first rib. The muscle fibers runs backwards and downwards and gets inserted to the cartilage of third or fourth rib. Serratus dorsalis anterior. It is a triangular muscle situated over the 5th, 6th and 7th ribs, which is partly covered by serratus cervicis. This muscle originates from the dorsal fascia, and the fleshy part has 3 digitations which are inserted to the anterior border and lateral surfaces of the 5th, 6th and 7th ribs. These are the bands of Longismos causterum. Serratus dorsalis posterior. These digitations are the parts of Serratus dorsalis posterior. It originates from the lumbo-dorsal fascia and is inserted to the posterior border and lateral surfaces of the 11th, 12th and 13th ribs. Longismos causterum. The muscle what you are seeing now is the longismos causterum. It consists of the lumbar and dorsal parts. This is the lumbar part which originates from the lateral angle of the ilium and the transverse process of lumbar vertebrae. The muscle runs forward and is finally inserted to the posterior border of the rib. These are the costal parts inserted to the posterior border of all ribs and transverse process of last cervical vertebrae. Longismos dorsi. Now, the scalpel shows the longismos dorsi muscle, which is the longest muscle in the body. It originates from the crest and lateral angle of ilium, summits of sacral, lumbar, dorsal, and supraspinous ligament. At the level of the seventh rib, this muscle is divided into the dorsal and ventral parts. Middle finger of the hand is over the dorsal part and index finger is over the ventral part. Between these two parts, the tip of the scalpel shows the origin of complexus muscle which runs in between them. Now, the scalpel shows the dorsal part. Since it passes under the complexus, further course of this muscle is not visible now. Now, the complexus muscle over the dorsal part has been removed so as to visualize the ventral part, which is inserted to the dorsal spine of the last 3 or 4 cervical vertebrae. Now, the scalpel shows the dorsal part. Further course of this muscle is visible now. Supraspinous ligament. Are you able to identify a yellow-colored band-like structure below the skin? That is the supraspinous ligament. It is entirely made of yellow elastic tissue which extends from sacrum to occipital bone. Let us see the course of this ligament. This is the dorso-lumbar part which originates from the sacral spines, runs over the spines of lumbar and dorsal vertebra. Look at the level of the dorsal spine of the first thoracic vertebra where the dorso-lumbar part ends. Afterwards, this is continued by the cervical part, which is otherwise known as the ligamentum nuchae. The scalpel now shows the ligamentum nuchae of the left side. This is again divided into a dorsal funicular and ventral lamellar parts. This is the dorsal funicular part which runs upwards and forwards and is inserted to the external occipital protuberance. Besides this, you can see the insertion of complexus muscle. Now the pointer shows the ventral lamellar part which is thicker and broader. This is made up of anterior and posterior divisions. This is the anterior division which is double. It has been cut to show the two parts of the anterior division and are inserted to the spines of second, third and fourth cervical vertebrae. Now the pointer shows the posterior division which is single and is inserted to the spines of fifth, sixth and seventh cervical vertebrae. These oblique bundles of muscles are multifidus dorsi. They are directed upward and forward. The bundles arise from the transverse process of the thoracic vertebrae and are inserted to the lateral face of spines of preceding vertebrae. Ligamentum Costarum. These small oblique bundles below the multifidus dorsi, situated at the upper part of the intercostal spaces, are the Ligamentum Costarum. They are 10 to 11 in numbers. Each bundle arises from the transverse process of dorsal vertebrae and runs downward and backward to be inserted to the anterior border of the succeeding rib. Retraction Costarum. This small triangular muscle situated behind the last rib and below the Longismos costarum is the Retraction Costarum. It originates from the transverse process of the first 2 or 3 lumbar vertebrae. It is inserted to the posterior border of the last rib. Intercostal muscle. The space between 2 ribs is the intercostal space and is filled up by intercostal muscles. They are external and internal intercostal muscles. Now you are able to see the 6th intercostal space between the posterior border of the 6th rib and anterior border of 7th rib. This muscle is the external intercostal muscle whose fibers are running downward and backward. Make a rectangular window at the middle of the 6th intercostal space like this. The external intercostal muscle is reflected forward. This exposes the internal intercostal muscle. The fibers of this muscle run downward and forward. A similar rectangular window is made at the 6th intercostal space by cutting the internal intercostal muscle. Reflecting the muscle forward, a white colored membrane is visible. This is the costal pleura lining the intercostal space. Another rectangular window is made in the costal pleura. This exposes the pleural cavity and the brown colored tissue at the tip of the forceps is the costal surface of the left lung. Note the posterior border of the last rib. It is continued by the costal cartilage. Similar cartilage of all external ribs join to form the costal arch. Left lung has been removed and the mediastinal space is exposed now. The area where the heart and major blood vessels are present is the middle mediastinal space. The space in front of this is the anterior mediastinum and the space behind is the posterior mediastinum. Let us see the structures present in these spaces one by one. We shall start with the anterior mediastinal space. The area in front of the heart is the anterior mediastinum. Now you are able to see 3 large tubular structures here. The tube situated at the center is the trachea. Above this, the pink-colored tube is the esophagus. The nerve passing on the side of the trachea is the recurrent laryngeal nerve, which supplies all the laryngeal muscles except cricothyroideus. This is the longus colli muscle covering the ventral surface of the bodies of cervical vertebrae. This tubular structure arising from the heart below the trachea is the common brachiocephalic trunk. These are the branches supplying blood to forelimbs and anterior part of the body. Notice the vagus nerve running on the ventral aspect of the common brachiocephalic trunk. Note the branch supplying the diaphragm. See the anterior mediastinal lymph nodes in front of the left brachial artery. Carefully notice the component of the autonomic nervous system, stellate ganglion. It is a large fusiform-shaped sympathetic ganglion placed on the longus colli at the level of the upper end of the first rib. It results by the fusion of the posterior cervical ganglion and first thoracic ganglion. Note the common brachiocephalic trunk arising from the convexity of aortic arch, which runs forward in the anterior mediastinum. At the level of the third rib, it detaches this left brachial artery which supplies the entire forelimb. Now the pointer shows the costal cervical trunk. This is the costal part which divides into the dorsal artery and the subcostal artery. Now the pointer is kept over the cervical part which runs upward and forward. Then it divides into deep cervical artery which supplies the cervical muscles. This larger branch is the vertebral artery which enters the canalis transversaris of cervical vertebrae. Note the nerve accompanying, which is the nervus transversaris. This is the left brachial artery. Note the internal thoracic artery arising from the ventral face of the brachial artery. It runs downward and backward and reaches the floor of the thoracic cavity. This is the inferior cervical artery arising from the anterior face of the brachial artery. It runs forward to supply the pectorals and brachiocephalicus muscle. After giving the brachial artery, the common brachiocephalic trunk gives off the brachiocephalic artery. Note the brachiocephalic artery now from where the right brachial artery arises. Note the common carotid trunk which gives off right and left carotid arteries. Now let us move to the middle mediastinal space. Heart is the major organ which occupies most of the space of the middle mediastinum. See the left view of the heart with pericardium. See the left view of the heart with pericardium. This bulb-like structure is the conus arteriosus, where the pulmonary artery begins from the right ventricle. See the left atrium. Notice the openings of the pulmonary veins into it. This is the right atrium. Note the left ventricle, which forms the apex of the heart, and the right ventricle in front of it. See the major arterial trunk, the aorta, passing from the left ventricle. It passes backwards as thoracic aorta. Note the phrenic nerve passing over the heart in the middle mediastinum. It reaches the posterior mediastinum and terminates in the diaphragm. You can also see portion of the trachea, esophagus, vagus nerve, and the left recurrent laryngeal nerve that winds around the aortic arch. Note the vena hemiazygos, which is a large unpaired vein on the left side of the thoracic cavity, which runs over the dorsal face of aorta and opens into the right atrium. Notice the convexity of the aortic arch. This is the phrenic nerve supplying the diaphragm. Note the middle mediastinal lymph nodes situated on the ventral face of the aorta. These small red-colored nodules are the hemal lymph nodes. Now let us move to the posterior mediastinum. See the boundary of the posterior mediastinal space located behind the heart. The scalpel is showing the continuation of the esophagus. This is the terminal portion of the esophagus. Afterwards, it enters the abdominal cavity through hiatus esophageal into the diaphragm. This is the dorsal vagal trunk on the dorsal aspect of the esophagus. And now the pointer shows the ventral vagal trunk on the ventral aspect of the esophagus. This elongated structure situated on the dorsal face of the esophagus is the posterior mediastinal lymph node. Notice a small transparent tube in front of the lymph node. This is the thoracic duct, which is a large lymphatic duct in the body. See, this is also a posterior mediastinal lymph node. You just follow the pointer which shows the aortic arch. Note the lymph nodes on the dorsal face of the aorta. The aorta runs backward and upward as thoracic aorta. This is the hiatus aorticus through which the thoracic aorta enters the abdominal cavity as abdominal aorta. Note the terminal part of the left phrenic nerve, which is divided into two branches in the posterior mediastinum. The ventral branch supplies the muscular rim of the diaphragm. This is the dorsal branch, which runs upwards and backwards to supply the tendinous part of the diaphragm. This brown-colored tissue behind the phrenic nerve is the diaphragmatic lobe of the right lung.